So, first speaker that we have kicking us off is Rhodes. Robin has been TSA's HR advisor for near on 30 years and has an exceptional amount of experience within the industry, in particular in terms of HR support. So I'd like to welcome him here today to talk about looking after your staff. Robin.
Thank you, Julia. Good morning, everybody. And this is basically an update on some of the key HR topics that have occurred in the last 6 to 9 months have attracted people's interest. But the title of the session is Looking After Your Staff. And I think one of the concepts that help in addressing that is one that's been used for a very long while on health and safety, but it's not been used in a wider scope, and that is the duty of care. And I think that duty of care can be applied outside not just health and safety, but getting into the well-being of employees. And nothing is more certain than in this industry particularly, with the national living wage coming up, companies are going to be seeking wherever they can to improve productivity. And unless you're doing that with the willing support of your employees, you're going to have a problem. One of the things that I think is very important, and it's an area that I don't think even some of the larger companies address, is the idea of performance appraisal for the most junior hourly paid employees. Because quite frankly, that's where some of the possibilities for significant improvements in productivity exist, is with hourly paid employees. And like all of us, they would like to know what it is they're supposed to be doing, how they're doing it, and what they need to do to improve in it. Because they're going to have to take a part in making sure that they've got reasonably secure employment in the future. They are a key part of the process. Another area of law at the moment which is causing quite a kerfuffle, and I can't say that it is necessarily wrong because the discrimination laws really are wickedly complex. And if you even vaguely want to start an adversarial process, then you're probably going to need a lawyer very close at hand. In terms of the practicalities of discrimination in the workplace, there are 2 words really that encapsulate the lot, and it doesn't matter. There are about 10 or a dozen different titles now, from discrimination on the grounds of race, on the grounds of gender, on the grounds of gender reassignment, on religion and belief, all sorts of headings. The key, the message that's easy enough to get across to the employees is that they need to treat others, whether they're employees, whether they're members of the public, or friends, with dignity and respect. And if they do that, they won't fall foul of discrimination laws. So I think it's important that companies get that message across to folk. One of the populous areas for this at the moment, very obviously, is the social media. And a fairly significant proportion of the employment tribunal cases, and they have dropped very significantly over the last couple of years, but quite a significant proportion of them are people who've fallen foul of comments they've made on social media going out to a wider audience, causing a problem. And they didn't think, because they were doing it at home on their phone or their iPad or computer or whatever, they didn't think it was anything to do with work. But of course, if it affects work, it is. The usual defence, which I find quite honestly laughable in most instances, is the sort of legalistic one. Well, you're invading my privacy looking at things like that. But of course, social media do have privacy settings. And if people don't use the bloody things, you can hardly blame an employer for saying this is affecting us. And I've seen some really quite colourful things going on there. Another area that's attracted attention recently is pensions. Most companies now, because we're getting into the situation where we've got companies with fewer than 10 employees, having the situation of having workplace pensions, auto-enrolment. Nearly all of them are in place or planned to be in place in the next 12 months or so. It is an additional cost on top of living wages, but in terms of long-term economic well-being for the employees, it's a very important move. And I think, whilst employers shouldn't be in the business of persuasion, I think suggesting to an employee they need to make provision for their older age is going to be very sensible. Working time regulations have cropped up recently on a couple of fronts. One is for mobile workers. The European Court of Justice has decided in its wisdom that if an employee has no fixed place of work, and in the laundry industry, for example, that is probably customer service people who may go straight from home to a customer and at the end of the day go from a customer back home, according to the European Court of Justice, that working time travelling to and from is working time, which means that if it is working time, it will have to be counted when looking at whether they're working 48 hours a week or not. That is a significant problem in itself, but I think the one that follows that is that if it is working time, should it be paid for with the national living wage or the national minimum wage? That is going to be a very significant increase in cost for those jobs. At the moment, there's no definitive answer, and this will happen a couple of times with the things I say this morning. As of Friday of last week, namely the 22nd of April, ACAS is assessing the impact of that and will produce something as soon as they know. Another one which is potentially expensive is holiday pay calculations. And here, this is an English senior court judgment looking at a reference from the European Court of Justice. And what they have identified is that if it's guaranteed overtime, in other words, the employer is obliged to pay it, then it should be used in the calculation of holiday pay. If it's non-guaranteed overtime, but the employee is required to work it, it still ought to be calculated, used in the calculation of holiday pay. The blurred edge occurs if the overtime is only voluntary. ACAS again, as of Friday, and I spoke to them about this, say they are assessing this at the moment. What they also told me, which I found interesting, is that there isn't a single case yet that's been taken to a tribunal to make a judgment on this. Now, as they say, some cases may have settled. But when I said, well, are there any cases coming up? They said, no. Now, I find that very surprising that a trade union really isn't heavily sponsoring this, because having average earnings for a holiday pay calculator rather than your normal basic week is a bit of a problem. At the end of the day, I was speaking to a financial director in the industry on Friday. At the end of the day, I said to her, look, don't start making provisions yet, but that's the sort of thing you might have mentally in mind, because the definition for holiday pay is pay for a normal working week. And UK law at the moment says a normal working week is the normal basic hours for that week. But if somebody normally works overtime, I think it's almost inevitable that we may find that that's going to be included in the calculation for holiday pay. Parental leave is another area which is causing grief, with partners sharing the parental leave in future, which, if they work for different employers, makes the admin of it really quite interesting. This is another area where planning for HR is utterly critical. If you know a lady is pregnant, then I think you sit down and talk to her about when she's likely to be leaving, and before she leaves, you determine the date when she's going to be returning, whether it's 9 months or 12 months ahead. If she wants to change that date, how much notice would she need to give you? And then you need to say, if you're thinking of coming back on flexible working because you've got a child and child-caring responsibilities, and you may therefore be making an application to go part-time or anything like that, let's talk now about what the availability of that work would be, what we could practically handle the way things are now. Not wait until she's, not wait until she's coming back and she doesn't give you the 8 weeks notice and she suddenly turns up and says, I want to work 3 days a week and it's Tuesday, Wednesday and Friday afternoon. that's the only way I can fit in the childcare. You're in for an argument. You sort it out before they even go off on maternity leave. Blindingly obvious, but it's not done very often. The TSA website is a resource now that Gillian and I have been working on. It's, as you can see up there, that's just one of the snapshots of it. Those are employment updates. I do regular employment bulletins. So, for example, on the two subjects where I've said ACAS are still assessing, and when they have got their subject matter determined, when they've got advice to give, they will be putting it on their website. When they do that, we will be issuing an employment bulletin, maybe even a stop press one if it's urgent, so that people are aware of it. The other bit of the resource, which is taking quite a lot more work, originally from Gillian last September, but from me at the moment, is we now have contracts of employment on there with appendices. We'll be putting a lot of ACAS PDFs on there about the most useful bits and pieces of information that you need, including health, safety and well-being, which is an excellent ACAS document. Return to work, what are the best ways of doing it? So it'll be a mixture of ACAS PDFs or occasionally PDFs from other sources, and documents that are used fairly widely in the industry so that you can have the confidence of knowing that this actually works on the ground in a laundry. Just out of interest on the well-being issue with employees, as I say, it goes beyond health and safety. I think looking after employees does look after their well-being. And, you know, at the end of the day, to be quite honest, for a lot of people, their health is almost as important, if not more important, than their wealth. So it is something that an employer can seriously contribute to. If we're looking at attendance management, and please don't call it absenteeism, because it immediately tells people where your mindset is. It says you are to blame for being absent. And that may well not be true. It could be a medical condition they don't have a lot of control over. It could even be family responsibilities that they find extremely difficult. Let's look at attendance management. If you want to park the blame anywhere, park it on unreliability. And say the unreliability presents us with a potential problem for our customers, but also for your colleagues that you work with. Because if you have frequent short-term absences, you're letting the team down that you work with, because they're going to have to run with the ball half the time. So put the blame on unreliability, and then you can both talk about parking the blame there, and you can have a sensible talk about it. Performance appraisal, I think, is important here again, looking at job design. And there's the ever-lurking issue, particularly in today's world, of people's mental health and stress at work. And if you're going to talk about absenteeism, and they may have a job description, but you never do any performance appraisal. But what you do tell them is as soon as their performance is good, you climb all over them. That is going to be a stressful situation. The chances of getting anything sensible out of it are virtually nil. And there's one area of HR where there's a wonderful misunderstanding grown out of an industry that is riddled with political correctness, which is the discrimination laws and the Equality Act of 2010. Most companies in 2009 had an application form for potential employees which included a great big section on their health. And the Equality Act of 2010 said you cannot ask any questions to do with somebody's health, whether they're disabled, what their attendance record is like. You cannot ask any of that until you have made them an offer. But let me just read you something, because the authority is a booklet entitled The Equality Act 2010. What do I need to know? It's a quick start guide to the ban on questions about health and disability during recruitment. And the quote is, Once the employer has decided that a job applicant meets the requirements for work, the employer might make the applicant a job offer or place the applicant in a pool of successful applicants to be offered jobs as vacancies arise. At this point, the employer is allowed to make the offer conditional upon the successful applicant meeting the employer's health and other requirements. The Act does not prevent the employer asking questions relating to health or disability. Now, I don't think you should take any employee on having already asked health questions. You've made them an offer. I think as soon as you actually want them to start work, or as soon as you've put them in this pool, which I think is a very useful concept, as soon as a vacancy comes up, you've been successful, we'll go through all the health and safety requirements. Part of the induction process then will be a detailed understanding of any problems they have with regard to health. And you can say to them, what sort of attendance record have you got over the last couple of years? And if it isn't good, you can't say, well, we're not going to start you then, because you're back into the area of discriminating on the grounds of their health. But what you can do is to say, look, reliability is very important for us, for your colleagues and for our customers. So you haven't had a very good track record, you've understood that. We are going to be monitoring it fairly closely during your probation period, and hopefully through discussions with yourself and getting some sort of medical input should we need it, you will have a better attendance record, because if you don't, you may not go through the process. So it isn't as big a hurdle as people originally said or thought. There's now also a huge advantage for smaller companies, a fit-for-work service, which is in fact an occupational health service provided by the government, and which was drawn up with the assistance of the medical profession, ACAS, trade unions, employers. Theoretically, a GP should consider, not necessarily do it, consider passing an employee's details for assessment to this service when they've been off work for 4 weeks continuously. Whether they do or not's a different matter. But also an employer can seek to make a reference to the service for an employee by phoning their number and saying, we have some difficulties with this employee with regard to their health, and we think some occupational health input would be very useful to us and the employee. It isn't just we're trying to nail them down. We really think we've got a duty of care towards them, we want that to be satisfied, but we've also got a problem about reliability with their health. They have come forward with rules about eligibility of which employees can be passed on to the service, which are a little bit different from the terms of reference they said they were going to have before the service came in. But I think the service may change in due course. Eligible employees are those who have been absent for more than 4 weeks, who have a reasonable likelihood of making a phased return to work, and have provided their consent. And their consent is only verbal. It isn't like the written consent about writing to a GP. Now, that's interesting, a reasonable likelihood of making a phased return to work. Some of the bigger problems which the service was originally set up to grapple with were employees who'd been off for 6-9 months or so. Very difficult for an employer, because behind this issue lurks the potential of disability discrimination. Having an independent occupational health service to call on to give an opinion, and one which was supposedly going, if the employee could no longer reasonably work with that employer, go to other government agencies to see what could be organised, seemed wonderful. They fall out of the definition of eligible employees in terms of a reasonable likelihood of making a phased return to work. The service has only been in for about 4 or 5 months. Let's see how it goes. I think eventually it will expand. The return to work mechanism is an obvious one. It's something where it's a very difficult discipline. If you're a production manager or production supervisor, quite a lot of the comment about your effectiveness will be output, output, output. This actually takes time. But I think if you find somebody's returned to work, they've been off for a while. You have a very brief word with them saying, I'll catch a word with you later on in the day. In other words, you fit it into your plans for that day, and then you sit down and talk to them about it. With their interests in mind, making absolutely sure that they're safe to work, but also with yours in mind, saying, is it likely to occur again? How do we handle it? Do you need some more medical input? The return to work document that I've been using with a number of companies in the industry will be on this website within the next 2 or 3 months. It's only advisory. But again, what we're doing is trying to move away from blame and trying to share the resolution of a problem. So, Speaker's Corner. Any questions to nail me into that corner from anybody in the audience? No? God, you are all well behaved. Well, apparently. Thank you.